Although prohibited by the London Naval Treaty from doing so, the Imperial Japanese Navy used treachery and deceit to amass a large fleet of formidable heavy cruisers outfitted with 24 long lance torpedoes, rendering them unmatched in lethality by other navies at the time. This was made possible by the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to construct heavy cruisers that were passed off as light cruisers, allowing them to dominate the nighttime naval engagements during the early stages of the war.
The London Naval Treaty 1930 has just been signed.
Japan was granted 12 heavy cruisers under the terms of the 1930 London Naval Treaty, while the United States was permitted to construct 15 by 1936. The Japanese were far from satisfied and resented being seen as an inferior nation during the negotiations. Japan desperately wanted more heavy cruisers. They were seen as essential to Japan's naval strategy. Since Japan had already reached its heavy cruiser tonnage limit, it was prohibited by the treaty from building anymore. Despite having unallocated light cruiser tonnage, Japanese naval strategy did not see the need for additional light cruisers in the fleet, considering them to be little more than large destroyers. This excess light cruiser tonnage, along with the desire to overtake the U.S. in heavy cruiser strength, led to one of the most dishonest and bizarre attempts ever made to bypass treaty obligations. Before Yamamoto took command of the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1939, Japan's plans for war with the U.S. were organized on the premise that if Japan invaded the Philippines, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would launch an attack from its home base in Hawaii with the goal of destroying the Japanese invasion fleet. Dubbed Plan Orange, this was indeed the U.S. Navy's strategy in the event of a Japanese attack on the Philippines. This Philippine relief force would be intercepted by the IJN just south of Japan and forced into a decisive battle. This strategy was called Kantai Kessen, or Decisive Single Battle Doctrine. The origins of this doctrine can be found in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, when a Japanese fleet destroyed a larger Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, forcing the Russian Empire to sue for peace. The main issue facing Japan was that the United States had a larger fleet and would be in a stronger position when the decisive battle occurred. Japanese strategists thought they could counter this numerical weakness prior to the battle by taking advantage of the fact that their opponents were fighting far from their home ports. As part of its gradual attrition plan, the IJN developed 3 tactics to weaken the U.S. fleet before it reached the Western Pacific. First, submarines would patrol the U.S. fleet's route, picking off targets. Secondly, land-based bombers operating from Japanese-held islands with support from carrier-based aircraft would harass the fleet along the route. Finally, the night before the battle, heavy cruisers supported by destroyers would use their faster speed to launch hit-and-run attacks, launching a volley of deadly long-lance torpedoes at U.S. battleships before withdrawing to the main fleet for the decisive battle the next day. It was hoped that this would reduce the size of the U.S. fleet to a point where the Japanese battle line could defeat it in a battleship versus battleship fight to the death. Since heavy cruisers were central to the Imperial Navy's progressive attrition plan, they were eager to increase their numbers while still abiding by the terms of the London Naval Treaty. Japan came up with a plan to build light cruisers that, in essence, were heavy cruisers in disguise. Enter the Mogami-class light cruisers, dubbed cheat cruisers extraordinaire. To qualify as a light cruiser, the Mogamis would have to be armed with 6-inch guns and have a displacement of 8,500 tons. The first issue was solved by designing the barbettes, which supported the main armament, to be robust and large enough to support an 8-inch gun turret, even though they would initially be equipped with a lighter 6-inch gun turret. When the ruse was no longer required, the turrets could be replaced with 8-inch gun turrets, which would be built in preparation for this eventuality. The weight issue would be solved by a combination of clever design and plain old-fashioned lying. Because the IJN would not compromise on speed or protection, the designers argued that no amount of creative engineering could keep the ships within the 8,500-ton limit. Although the declared weight remained at 8,500 tons, the true design limit was raised to 9,500 tons. To conserve weight, the ships were given a more compact superstructure made of aluminium, which was welded rather than riveted. Although only 10 boilers were installed compared to 12 in the previous classes, the new geared impulse turbines increased overall shaft horsepower. The chimney arrangement was redesigned to minimize weight. The forward chimney was reclined from its base so that, at its top, it merged with the middle and rear funnels. Britain and the U.S. looked on in dismay as the Mogami class was launched in 1934, for there was nothing afloat among light cruisers to match them. The Japanese ships carried 15 guns, while the latest American light cruisers, with their distinctly antiquated designs, carried only 10. Out of those 10 guns, only 7 were able to fire broadside, meaning that the Mogami, in effect, had over twice the firepower and considerably better protection. Even though light cruiser design was more developed in Europe, the best of them only carried 9 6-inch guns. In 1935, as the Mogami was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy, preparations for countering the new threat were underway in the United States and Great Britain. Although the Mogami class were not light cruisers, they would have a significant impact on light cruiser designs into the future, since the U.S. and Royal Navy spent considerable time and resources developing powerful light cruisers to counter ships that were essentially non-existent. The Director of Naval Construction responded to a question from the Royal Navy regarding how the Japanese were able to build such powerful ships with such a small displacement by saying they must be building their ships out of cardboard or lying. The U.S. Navy's Brooklyn and the Royal Navy's Newcastle class began appearing in 1937. With the clouds of war gathering and the limitations of the London Naval Treaty irrelevant by 1939, the masquerade was abandoned, and Japan's revolutionary new cruisers could now fulfill what they had been designed for from the start. The 4 Mogami-class ships stealthily made their way into Japanese shipyards, where the 8-inch turrets that naturally matched the heavy cruiser hulls were installed in place of the turrets that had once adorned them. The Mogamis underwent extensive reconstruction in addition to having their triple 6-inch turrets removed for use as secondary armament on the Yamato-class super battleships. The superstructure was reinforced, torpedo bulges were added, and other modernization initiatives were completed. Overall, full displacement increased to over 13,000 tons, which is significantly more than the 8,500 tons that were first reported. After reconstruction, the design's high speed, strong armor protection, and heavy armament made it one of the best in the world during the early stages of the Pacific War. Although the destruction of the U.S. Navy's battleships at Pearl Harbor meant Japanese heavy cruisers would not be required for the planned gradual attrition strategy, the IJN's emphasis on training in night battle tactics and use of the powerful long-lance torpedo served them well throughout the war, until the overwhelming odds resulted in their inevitable destruction.
If you liked this video, there are many similar high-quality videos on my channel.